In this lesson, we'll learn how we can use V-Ray to add fur to our polygon objects. Alright, so for this scene, I'm going to start with just a relatively simple sphere. Now, let's start to add some fur onto this using the V-Ray fur options. So with this selected, let's go to Create, V-Ray, and all the way kind of toward the middle of this, we should see an option for Add V-Ray Fur to Selection. Now, you will notice that this works for polygon meshes only, so if you're using something like NURBS, this really won't be able to work for you. So with this option active, now you can start to see that really right away we start to get some hair in our scene. Now, the actual size of your hair is actually fixed, so depending on how small or how large your object is, your hair may appear extremely long. So you can see in my case, I actually have my sphere scaled up pretty large to begin with. So if, again, my object were very, very small, the hair, by comparison, would probably seem really, really long, and you can see that as I start to scale my sphere down. So let's go ahead and just take a look at just what this looks like if I were to render this out. Right, so you can see that V-Ray is, at render time, actually going to start generating geometry around those little hair strands. So you can start to see kind of the individual segments of these hair strands. And you can see that they actually do a really good job of casting shadows and really behaving exactly as normal geometry would at render time. Now, if we wanted to change the color of our hair, that's really determined by the actual materials that are applied to our objects that actually have the hair connected to them. So at the moment, this sphere is just using the default Lambert material, but if I were to take this orange V-Ray material and drop this onto our sphere, or really any material of any color, and then if we were to come in and re-render this, what we should see is now that the hair will actually inherit the color of that material. And you can see that once the render finishes, that's exactly what we get. We should also be able to allow the fur to inherit any color or texture maps that we may have plugged into the surface of this material as well. Alright, now let's take a look at a few of the attributes that are going to control the actual look and behavior of this fur. So if we select the actual fur itself and open up the attributes, the first option we're going to come to is the V-Ray Fur Preview. So what this is essentially doing is allowing us to determine whether or not we can actually see the preview of this fur in the viewport. So this fur actually doesn't exist in the scene itself. It will actually be generated by V-Ray at render time. So for that reason, we can actually start to come in and determine just how many of these preview hairs will be displayed. So if maybe your graphics card is having a little bit harder time keeping up, you can start to dial down this max preview strands, or if you don't have any problem, you can actually start to take this up to some pretty high levels, just so you can start to get a little bit more precise look and a little bit more accurate feedback of just how this is going to look at render time. And we can also control at render time just what is going to occur as far as the overall rendering processes, whether or not these hairs are going to be able to cast shadows, be seen by the primary visibility, but maybe still have shadows visible in reflections and refractions, things like that. Now, if we take a look over in the actual V-Ray Fur properties, this is where we can actually start to control a lot more things that will actually be related to the hair. So things like the length. So if we started to dial this up or down, we can start to make our hair length shorter or longer, depending on exactly what we want. We can also adjust the hair thickness. So right now you can see that the overall thickness of our hair is actually pretty strong. So if we actually wanted these hairs to be a little bit thinner, we can start to come in and dial down this thickness. So if I were to take this image, save that for comparison, and you can see now that compared to what we had before, our individual hair strands are now much, much thinner. So whereas before we kind of had these big kind of spaghetti strands of hair, now we can actually start to get something that looks a little bit more realistic. Right, now below this we also have a few options, things like gravity. So depending on how strong we want this kind of a fake gravity to be pulling these hair pieces down, we can start to adjust that strength. Now keep in mind that this is not really going to be a true gravity because these V-Ray hair strands or V-Ray fur strands are not actually dynamically reactive. So as I were to take this sphere and start to move this and animate this going back and forth, the V-Ray fur really doesn't have any kind of dynamics. So keep in mind that this gravity is not really a truly dynamics-driven gravity. It's just an overall curvature for these different hair strands. So in addition to the actual gravity that's pulling these down, we actually do have a bend capability for these hairs, so we can start to add some additional bending functions to those if we want. And we also have the ability to taper the hair, so it can actually start to get thicker at the root and then start to thin out kind of as we start to get close to the tip of the hair. So this would be a little bit easier to see if I were to take my thickness and increase that a little bit higher. Now we can start to take this taper and begin increasing that, so that way we should notice a pretty dramatic change in the thickness from the root down to the tip of the hair. And now you can see that once this render completes, that the hair definitely starts to change its overall thickness. So you can start to see from the root, we start out relatively thick, and then as we start to kind of progress out to the tip of the hair, that it starts to really kind of thin out and really kind of helps just give this a little bit more realistic sense of fur, as opposed to kind of what we were getting before with just kind of these large kind of spaghetti strands. All right, now we also have the ability to start to control the number of knots that we have here. We also have the ability to control the number of sides, but currently this option actually is disabled, so we can adjust this feature if we want to, but it really won't have any effect. At render time, V-Ray will go ahead and just render these rounded segments just as they should be. So typically, this would actually control the number of sides that are created and our extruded geometry along the hair, but like I said, currently in this release of V-Ray for Maya, this feature is actually disabled. Now what we can control are the number of knots along the length of the hair. So if we were to take a look, we can actually see some of the individual segments in our hair strands, and this might be a little bit easier if I were to go back to my fur preview and dial this down so we actually have a fewer number of hairs. So by adjusting the number of knots, you can see we're actually adjusting essentially the overall smoothness of this strand of hair. So with low values, you start to see this really chunky appearance in our hair length. And as we start to increase, you can see our hair strands start to get smoother and smoother and more cleanly rounded. Now keep in mind that as you start to increase the number of knots, you're actually starting to increase the overall density of your geometry. So increasing the number of knots will actually start to slow down your render times pretty significantly. So just try to find a value that works for you, and then try not to overcrank this value too high. Now we can also choose whether or not these different hair strands will be rendered with flat normals. So this will be a little bit easier to see if I were to take my taper and bring this back to 0. So with flat normals, what this should do is, instead of giving this individual hair strands this rounded kind of a cylindrical shape, it should try to render those as more of a flat ribbon. So if I were to take this and re-render the image, and you can see that that's pretty much exactly what we're getting now. Whereas before we had sort of these rounded cylindrical shaped hairs, now we're starting to get something that is much more flat, again just sort of like a ribbon. So if you really are going to be rendering some shorter hairs, or hairs that are much smaller, or even hairs that are going to be rendered from a distance, and you really don't need to have all the detail of having these perfectly rounded cylindrical shaped hairs, you can turn on this flat normals option and start to save yourself potentially a little bit of render time in the process, because now that's just one extra thing that V-Ray isn't really having to calculate anymore. Now we do have some controls further down for some variance. So if we actually wanted to start varying the direction of our hairs, with this set to 0, every hair should pretty much follow the exact same direction and exact same orientation in relation to their actual parent faces that they're being emitted from. But we can start to add a little bit more variation to that, kind of add a little bit more of a kind of wild, kind of unkempt hair. We can also start to add a little bit of variance for the length. So if we wanted each of these hairs to be exactly the same length, we could do that. Or if we wanted to, again, just add a little bit more variation, create something that is going to be a little bit more natural, we can definitely start to increase that variance as well. We can also start to increase the overall thickness variance, so that way every single one of these hairs won't necessarily be the exact same thickness, but we can start to randomize that a little bit as well. And then we can also start to randomize the gravity. So this gravity effect is maybe pulling down on some hairs a little bit stronger than others. So maybe if we wanted to get a little bit more of a appearance of some static cling or things like that, we can start to introduce that. Now, the distribution is where we actually begin controlling how many hairs will be generated at render time. So right now the distribution is set to per face, so that way for every single face on this polygon sphere, we're going to have 10 hairs that get emitted from that face. Now if we were to bring this down to 1, we should now just wind up with 1 hair per face. As we start to increase this, again, we'll start to now increase the overall number of hairs that are rendered. Now, once we pass a certain point, you'll notice that it's really not having much of an effect. And that is because right now, this fur preview, I have set to a pretty low value. So if we want to start to see a little bit more realistic representation of just what that's going to look like, we can start to increase the number of maximum preview strands, and now we'll get a little bit better idea of just how many hairs will be rendered. All right, but again, keep in mind that as you start to increase this value, your render times will start to increase pretty dramatically. So try to start with the lowest number of hairs that you can get away with, and then gradually start to increase that until you find a value that works for you. Now, kind of below this area, we have the areas where we can actually start to plug in some different texture maps to begin driving a few of these different attributes. So let's say, for example, we wanted to add a little bit more variance to the length of our hair, or we actually wanted the hair to only be emitted in certain areas. So we can start to come in and plug in some kind of a length texture. So let's go ahead and plug this in. Use something like a 2D checker for this. This should be a good example. Now, when we plug this in, you'll notice that nothing really seems to happen. And that's because it's actually going to be looking for the alpha channel information of this checker. So let's make sure we go into the color balance of this checker and make sure we turn on alpha is luminance. And now, once we do that, you can start to see some of the changes in this. And if we were to go back to something like the length and start to shorten this up, now you can actually see the pattern of this checker texture in the fur itself. So if we wanted to come back in here and start to make adjustments to this, you can see essentially now the black areas of our texture are basically going to refer to areas where we have no hair length at all. As we start to get closer into the white, you can see our hair gets longer and longer. Right, so we can come in and control this pretty interactively if we want to. And once we render that out, that should be reflected in the render as well. All right, very nice. And you can see that's exactly what we get. Now, if you're starting to work here and you decide at some point in time maybe you want to take this fur controls off of your object, all we would have to do is select our object, go back to our Create menu, into V-Ray, and remove V-Ray Fur from selection, or remove it from selection and hierarchy, which is actually a little bit further down on this list. So just to make sure you do get it off from everything in this object, I like to use this remove selection from selection and hierarchy. And once we do that, you notice that the V-Ray Fur has now been completely removed. And once we re-render this object, we should see it with no more of this fur. All right, so that's a look at how we can start to apply and control the different fur attributes in V-Ray.